Okay, so for this particular conversation, we're going to be talking about the female reproductive system. So we're getting into the last two conversations that we have. Reproductive system, we do a little bit differently. We break it down into 2 weeks just because we do have the male and the female anatomy. So as I said, this week we'll focus on the female anatomy. If you don't have a copy of this packet, I also will post it on Blackboard so that you guys will have access to it. And then next week when we have our face-to-face meeting, we'll come back and we'll finish up with the male reproductive system. So just starting out with the female reproductive system, there are 4 hormones that I want you guys to kind of jot down and really know well for this particular system. And some of them we will talk about again in the male reproductive system, and then we'll get into some other ones that apply as well. So the 4 major hormones that are going to play a role in the female system are luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, progesterone, and estrogen. And when we get into the packet, you guys will notice there's a picture. It kind of shows you how those hormones track throughout the month for the female, depending on what's going on. And we'll talk a little bit about why we see the rise and the fall of those different hormones. So again, the 4 that I want you guys to have are luteinizing hormone, abbreviated as LH, follicle stimulating hormone, which is abbreviated as FSH, and then progesterone and estrogen. Now, LH and FSH are going to work together as a partnership, and they are 2 hormones that are actually going to come from the pituitary gland, which we just talked about when we went through our endocrine system. And they are really going to target the ovaries and the process of ovulation. And if you're not overly familiar with that, that's fine. We're going to get into that here in just a little bit. But please understand that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone work together as a partnership. And their main goal is to really make sure that the entire preparation of the egg and the process of ovulation goes the way that it's supposed to. In response to LH and FSH, we have estrogen and progesterone. Now, they have a little bit different role. They're going to work pretty much together, and they are really preparing the body for what would happen if fertilization takes place. So if once that egg is released into the female anatomy, it is fertilized, there's going to be a series of steps that are going to need to be followed to make sure that we maintain that pregnancy. So progesterone and estrogen are going to make sure that the breast tissue is preparing and getting ready for possible fertilization, as well as the uterus. And there are a series of things that have to happen for that preparation as well. So those 4 hormones I want you guys to have down. As I mentioned, we'll talk about some of those same hormones when we get into the male body. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, comes up again. Follicle indicates the reproductive cells. So we're talking about the egg in the female and talking about the sperm in the male body. So we will see that in both of them. Estrogen tends to be predominantly a female hormone, and so we talk about that usually just with the females, even though guys do have a little bit of estrogen in their bodies, and testosterone likewise. Predominantly a male hormone, but we do have a little bit in the female body, and so we'll talk about that as well. When you guys start to get into the female body, one of the things that I want you to understand is how the ovaries work. And so we're going to talk through the structures of the female body, but I really want to focus on the ovaries to kind of highlight them in the beginning. The ovaries are the storage tank for the egg cells. What a lot of people don't understand is that a female is born with all the eggs that she will have for her entire lifetime. So during the process of fetal development, when a baby girl is growing inside of mom, part of that process is also building all of the eggs that she will have and need for her entire lifetime. So at birth, all of those eggs are already there and ready to go, so to speak. So if you look at that first slide that talks about the ovaries, just talking about that process and how the number of eggs within the female body really changes. So if you look at it, while baby is developing inside of mom, it talks about that you have several million eggs that are going to be formed at that point in time. As that embryological development takes place, that number is going to start to drop. And so by the time a baby girl is born, she has roughly 1,000,000 eggs between the two ovaries that she has within her body. Now, from that point of birth to puberty, those eggs are not needed. And so it's not uncommon to see a significant drop in the number of eggs that a female has to below half of that number. So we start with 1,000,000 at birth. By the time we get to puberty, we are down under 500,000 at that point. And I know it gives the number of 400,000. Again, remember these numbers are rough estimates. So at puberty, by the time those eggs would potentially be released into the female body to become fertilized, we're already down to half. Now, puberty happens at different times. This is something that we don't know why in some females we see it happen as early as at 8 or 9, and other females are well into their teens before they hit puberty. So there is an age range of when puberty will hit, and then there's also an age range of when that fertile period for a female will end. So for some women it is in their 40s, for some women it's in their 50s. But roughly during that time span of when a female would go through the process of ovulation on a monthly basis, you're looking at roughly only 400 to 500 of those eggs are going to be released. So even though we see those significant drops of going from several million down to 1,000,000, down to 500,000 by the time we hit puberty, you only need somewhere between that 400 and 500 range. And so we have well more than what we need to take us through that fertile period. So the last piece that I want you guys to understand about the ovaries is because those eggs are with us from day one, they can't go through the full process of development. So while they're sitting in the ovaries, they're in a dormant phase. Because if we allowed those egg cells to become completely ready to go from the time we were born, they would basically be sitting around doing nothing except aging for 10, 12, 14 years. And anytime you have something that is just sitting around and not being used, obviously there's the potential that it could become damaged, it could become ineffective. And so we don't want our egg cells to be fully developed. So they are taken through a certain point of development, and then our egg cells at the point of birth are put into a dormant phase, and they will remain dormant until we hit puberty. And then only during the process of ovulation are those eggs allowed to finish off their development and become full-fledged egg cells. So it's a little bit of a process just to ensure that when a female does finally does start going through the process of ovulation, that those eggs are in the best possible condition they could be in, and they haven't been sitting around for, like I said, 10 to 14 years waiting to be used. If you look at the slide that shows the organs of the female reproductive system, this picture shows up a couple of times in the packet. I'm going to take the time now to kind of go through those pictures and give you a brief explanation of each one of them. So starting on the top left, it shows the uterine tubes, and that's the terminology that I will use, but depending on your doctor and who's treating you, uterine tube is actually one of those body parts that gets multiple names, and all of them are perfectly acceptable. So if you are comfortable with another term and you use that, I will know what you are talking about. So we hear uterine tube, we hear fallopian tube, we hear oviducts. Whichever one you like, you can go with. These are going to be the structures that are actually going to carry the egg down to the uterus. So you have two of them, one on each side, and they extend from the ovary and down into the uterus, and their main goal is to track that egg once it's been released from the ovary and make sure that it gets delivered to the uterus itself. Now, you can't see it so much in this picture. There's another picture, a frontal picture of the uterus and this whole setup. It kind of looks like the ovary and the fimbriae and the uterine tube are all connected and one piece. They are not. The ovary and the fimbriae are not connected whatsoever. There is a space or a gap between those two. So please just keep that in mind as well as we talk about these different structures. Then you have the ovary itself. Again, this is a structure you have two of. You have one on the right-hand side of the body, one on the left-hand side. This is where the eggs are going to be stored. This is also predominantly where your estrogen production is going to come from. Not the only place, but most of your estrogen is going to be produced from those ovaries. Now, we talked about the fact that your eggs are there from the get-go, but once you actually go through puberty and the ovaries start releasing eggs, it's not uncommon for a female to experience different symptoms from 1 month to the next when she goes through her cycle. Some cycles can be very low-key, not a lot of cramping or any issues, and the next month it can be very intense and very different. And the reason for that is the ovaries actually alternate in which one releases the egg. So 1 month it will be the right ovary releasing, and the next month it's the left. And so they take turns back and forth from 1 month to the next. Because it is a different ovary releasing the egg, it can potentially trigger different symptoms, like I said. So if you notice that 1 month you have very intense cramping and the next month it's not so bad, it actually is dependent on which ovary is releasing the egg. So please understand, the right one only releases 6 times a year and the left one only releases 6 times a year. Then we have the uterus. So right now from this picture, the uterus is obviously not taking care of a developing embryo. But I wanted you guys to see position-wise where it sits in relationship to the urinary bladder, which is right beneath it. So obviously you can see in this situation with the uterus being empty, not really affecting or impacting the bladder very much. But if you start to put a developing baby in there and that baby is 6-7 pounds in size, because of where it sits on that bladder, it takes up some of that room, puts extra pressure on the bladder, and explains a lot of why our pregnant women complain about having to go to the bathroom all of the time, is because the space that the bladder normally has is greatly reduced because of that heavy weight that is now sitting on top of it. Just underneath that, we have the symphysis pubis. That is a bone structure that comes around from the coxabone. So that's where the two coxabone will unite in the front, and that is actually going to offer support to this reproductive region. So you can see that bone, just how it sits kind of under the other structures will help cradle it and help deal with some of that weight as baby continues to grow and develop. Then we have the urethra. So female anatomy has 3 exits or openings. The urethra, which is going to take urine out of the body. Then tucked behind that, we have the vagina, which is the AKA birth canal, where baby would pass through during the process of delivery, where blood would be expelled during the monthly cycle. And then we have the third and final one, which is the rectum, which is how solid waste would exit the female anatomy. So the urethra we've talked about within our excretory chapter, and how liquid waste would be eliminated from the body. Underneath that, we have the clitoris. So the clitoris is a bundle of nerves that we have within the female anatomy, and it is actually comparable to the penis in the male anatomy. They do a lot of the same things when they are stimulated. So what will actually happen with the clitoris is if that bundle of nerves is stimulated, it will actually trigger an excess amount of blood to be delivered to that area. You will see the clitoris expand in size for a period of time, and will continue during that process or during the period of the stimulation. Underneath that, we have the 2 skin folds that are in the female body. So you have the labium, it's the labia minor and the labia major. Here it says minus and majus. Again, different terms for the same body parts. Again, whichever one you feel more comfortable using is perfectly fine. But these 2 skin folds that you have within the female body, they do a couple of different things. Number 1, they help secure and hold moisture to the area. Number 2, they also create a barrier because you do have an opening to the outside world. Even though things typically should be moving out, sometimes things can move in and bring foreign particles with them. And because of that, your body wants to have a way to kind of potentially create a barrier so that foreign invaders don't have an easy path into the female body. So those two skin folds, like I said, number one, will work to keep moisture in this area. Number two, they're going to help create a barrier so that pathogens and things of that nature can't easily get into the body. And then another part of that process, the labia minor, the smaller, the two skin folds, you can tell the two apart because that one is going to lack any type of hair. The labia major, that is going to be those skin folds that are going to have hair on the surface. And so you can tell the difference between those two just based on the presence of hair or the lack of hair. Then we have the vaginal orifice. This is just the opening to the outside world. So when we talk about the birth canal, that vaginal orifice, fancy way of saying it's an opening. If you go to the right-hand side, it talks about the fimbriae. The fimbriae are finger-like extensions that you have coming off of the uterine tube, and they actually, because of the environment that they are in, kind of a liquid environment, they have a wave-like action. And what happens is because the ovary and the fimbriae are not secure, they are not physically attached to each other, when the egg ruptures from the ovary and it's released, if it doesn't get pulled in the right direction, it actually has the potential of moving into open space and not going where it's supposed to. So those fimbriae just create this wave-like action to help draw and pull that egg into the uterine tube and get it moving to where it's actually supposed to be. Then you have the rectouterine pouch. There's not really, it's a space that's created from the uterus, so from the backside of the uterus and then the front of the large intestine, where those two structures come together, you get this little V formation. Nothing happens there. It's just a space that is created between those two structures coming together, and they gave it the name rectouterine pouch. Anytime that you see recto, that is telling you that it is positioned behind something. And so this is just on the backside of the uterus. You would find this little space or gap that is created. Just below that, you have a structure known as the fornix. And really what this is the bottom part of the uterus where it starts to, and you can see it extends and kind of protrudes or pushes down into the vagina. That fornix is that piece that pushes down into that birth canal. The cervix is the bottom third of the uterus. So you can see the uterus kind of laying there on its side. And then if you look at just that bottom 1/3 portion of it, that is what the area that we refer to as the cervix. And then you have the rectum, that is where solid waste would exit the body. And just kind of seeing how it's all related. If you have a mom who's just gone through the process of labor, that is actually an area that they will check and monitor to make sure that they hear good sounds and movement postpartum, because there's a lot of trauma. You can see how close that vagina is, that birth canal, to the rectum, and that pressure of baby moving through that area can disrupt other body parts, and so they just want to make sure that everything is up and working again after mom delivers baby. So the vagina, I've referred to it a couple times now as the birth canal also. It's another common term or way to refer to it. Again, whatever you are more comfortable with. But if fertilization would occur and go to a full-term pregnancy, this is going to be the path that baby is going to take on its way out. If fertilization doesn't occur and the blood lining of the uterus is going to be expelled, that is where the blood would leave the female body. And then the last one that you have on there is the anus. That again is just the opening. That is the last part that solid waste would pass through upon exiting the female body. If you go to the next slide, it talks about the process of ovulation. And so kind of breaking down this picture, on the left-hand side, you can see the ovary itself. And then on the right-hand side, you can see those fimbriae and then extending into the uterine tube. The one thing I don't care for about this picture is it makes it look like those fimbriae are secure around the ovary and that it is completely intact. It is not. Okay, so there is a space, there is a potential for that egg, once it is released from the ovary, to get off path and not make its way into the uterine tube. So kind of talking about this process of ovulation. So with ovulation, keep in mind, going back to the start of our conversation, those eggs are not fully developed. So they could not become fertilized. There has to be a process that finishes them off, takes them through that final stage of development so that they are a fully formed egg cell. So if you look at the far left, it talks about the primordial follicle. Follicle is just referring to the egg cell. Okay? Primordial indicates that these are not fully developed. They are still in that dormant phase. They have not finished off meiosis, and so they are not able to be fertilized. And then as you start tracking that egg cell, it transitions into a primary follicle, and then it shows you the follicular cells and the primary oocyte. So as you see that time passing, what that's actually showing you is that those egg cells are now finishing off that final piece of development so that they are fully formed, developed eggs. So we're taking those dormant eggs, we're allowing them to finish off meiosis so that by the time that egg is released from the ovary, it's ready to go and it could potentially become fertilized. So you'll track that egg around and you'll notice that it eventually is going to rupture or break free from the ovary. Some people claim they can actually feel when this happens. Some people say they have no idea when it happens, but that egg is actually going to break through on the side of the ovary, and those fimbriae are right there. They have that wave-like action, and they're going to try and track that egg up into the uterine tube. Now, once the egg has released from the ovary, that's our ovulation. So the egg could potentially become fertilized. You'll notice though that if you continue to track around the ovary, that you get to a part where it says the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is the remnants of that egg development. So the egg itself leaves, but you have that corpus luteum that is left behind. And that's important because that corpus luteum actually gives off a hormone. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. But understand that you have that corpus luteum and it remains in the ovary, but it actually is going to produce a hormone of its own. And then that last one, the corpus albicans, that is actually scar tissue. So every time an egg ruptures free from the ovary, it is going to leave behind scar tissue on the surface of the ovary, and that will stay there for a few weeks, potentially up to a few months, and then it will eventually heal and you won't see it any longer. So that egg is released. We're going to try and track it up into the uterine tube. And the important part of that movement is that fertilization should actually happen in the uterine tube. A lot of people just believe that because the baby's going to implant in the uterus, that's where fertilization happens. That actually should take place in the uterine tube. And when we get to the frontal image, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So during the process of ovulation, when that egg is released from the body, I want to go back for just a second and kind of talk about what's happening with those 4 major hormones. So right at the start of the process of ovulation, what will happen is you'll have a very small rise in the amount of FSH. So that follicle stimulating hormone, during the first couple of days of the menstrual cycle, that FSH is going to increase in its overall level. And what that's going to do is it's actually going to cause that egg to start to develop. Now, during the process of the development of that egg, you will get one egg cell that is more dominant than the others. It grows larger, it has more material, it's just better equipped to become fertilized. And then you'll get these smaller ones that don't have as much material, aren't as healthy. And what happens is that FSH causes that development to happen. And then after the first couple of days, the FSH levels will drop back down. Now, the smaller eggs that didn't really develop, they can't survive without FSH. So because they're not as in good of a shape, they will actually disintegrate and be reabsorbed into the female body. that one dominant egg that had all of the good stuff doesn't need FSH to survive, and so it will actually be the egg that is selected to go through the process of ovulation and then rupture through the side of the ovary and start to make its way into the uterine tube. So one of the things that will happen with that dominant egg is it actually will start to give off its own hormone, and that will cause the luteinizing hormone to increase in level. Okay, so FSH goes first, gets the egg to start to develop, and then it drops off, allowing for just that dominant egg to continue the process. That dominant egg is going to give off its own hormone, and that's going to trigger the luteinizing hormone to increase in its levels during the month. Okay. So the egg ruptures out of the ovary and it starts to track its way into the uterine tube, and now we're going to get back to that corpus luteum. So that remnant that was left behind within the ovary itself is going to start to produce progesterone. So that was one of the other hormones that we talked about at the beginning. The progesterone is going to make sure that the blood lining in the uterus is maintained. So high progesterone levels, that blood lining is going to be maintained. Now, meanwhile, that egg is making its way through the uterine tube, and if it becomes fertilized, that egg at the point of fertilization will give off a hormone known as HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. So it's a little h and then a big C and a big G. That's its abbreviation, human chorionic gonadotropin. When you take a pregnancy test, that is what the pregnancy test is looking for. It is looking for that HCG hormone, and if it detects that hormone, that will give you a positive result. So the egg goes into the uterine tube, it becomes fertilized, it gives off that HCG. That HCG is going to keep those progesterone levels high. Progesterone makes sure that the uterine lining stays and is maintained, and that blood is not sloughed off. So that fertilized egg is going to continue its way from the uterine tube down into the uterus. That blood lining is being maintained because progesterone is remaining high. And now that fertilized egg has a place to burrow into that blood lining and start the process of developing a placenta, an umbilical cord, and going through the 9 months of development. If the egg is not fertilized, then no HCG is ever produced. And if the HCG is not produced, then the progesterone levels drop. There's nothing to maintain them, so they drop down. When progesterone levels drop down, that is going to cause that uterine lining, that blood lining, to be released, sloughed off. So the uterus will start to contract. As the walls of the uterus rub up against it, it breaks that blood lining away from the walls of the uterus. And as that process happens, that blood will then be released down through the birth canal and out of the body, and that would be the menstrual cycle. So we have, like I said, FSH and LH working at the beginning to get the egg developed and then where it needs to be. And then after that, progesterone is going to maintain that blood lining health until it does not get a signal that fertilization has happened. And at that point, the blood lining will be released and the whole process starts all over again. So the next one I want you guys to take a look at is the slide that's referred to as the uterine tubes. So this is a frontal view of the female anatomy. You can see the uterus in the middle. You have you can see now the uterine tubes coming off both the left and right side. On the right-hand side, you get a little bit better idea that fimbriae is not completely intact around the ovary. They are close by, but they are not secured. And you can see the 2 ovaries. You also can see on the right-hand side, they've done a cut of the uterus, and so you can see guess what? We have 3 layers, and this is the trend that we have seen time and time again. You have the endometrium, that is the inner layer. That is actually where the blood lining would form. It's on that inner layer of the uterus. You can see the thick myometrium, which is that muscle layer sandwiched in between in the middle of the two. And then you have the perimetrium, which is the outside layer of the uterus. Now, this picture does not do a great job to show it, but the muscles that are running through the uterus run in every single direction. They run diagonally, they run horizontally, they run vertically, they crisscross across the uterus, so that when labor actually does take place, no matter where baby is implanted, when those muscles contract, they all contract in a way that is going to push baby down and out for labor. Okay. It is an old wives' tale that where baby implants is going to be an indication of what gender they are. So if you're carrying high, if you're carrying low, at the point of implantation, baby does not know if it's going to be a male or a female. So wherever it takes up residence in the uterus has nothing to do with the gender. So anywhere that there's a blood lining, which is all throughout that inside of the uterus, baby could potentially implant and start development there. Now, because fertilization happens within the uterine tubes, sometimes, unfortunately, baby does not make it all the way down to the uterus, and baby will implant in the uterine tube. Because of the space and the fact that the uterine tubes are not designed to expand to accommodate a full-size baby, that is what we know as an ectopic pregnancy. And things will start to go well in the beginning. You'll get a positive pregnancy test because of that HCG that's being released from baby. But eventually baby's going to run out of room, and that is not going to be a viable pregnancy, because once baby has implanted there, there's just not the space, and you can do a lot of damage and a lot of harm to mom with an ectopic pregnancy because baby just expands past the space or capacity in that potential part of the body. So why do we want fertilization to happen within the uterine tube? The reason for that is sometimes mom becomes pregnant and she's not trying to become pregnant. So if fertilization happened within the uterus, the point between fertilization and implantation, when baby actually burrows into mom's blood lining and starts becoming dependent on everything mom puts in her body, would be a very, very short amount of time. With fertilization happening within the uterine tube, it can take anywhere for 7 to 10 days from the time that that egg becomes fertilized to the time it actually makes its way down to the uterus, implants, and becomes dependent on mom. So we reduce the amount, that window of time between when baby is needing mom for oxygen and nutrients and things of that nature, and when mom actually realizes she's pregnant. So, like I said, if fertilization happened within the uterus, implantation would be a few hours later, and baby would be dependent on mom very, very soon, and you could potentially have 2 weeks where baby is using mom's materials and mom doesn't even realize that she's pregnant. Fertilization happens in the uterine tube. Now we have 7 to 10 days where baby is making their way through mom's system before implantation happens, and now she's going to have fewer days between when baby is dependent on her and her actually realizing that she could potentially be pregnant. So it's a very important safety feature for baby that that fertilization happens within the uterine tube and not within the uterus. So that final slide that you have kind of shows you the hormone levels throughout the month. You can see those LH and FSH levels, and they kind of mimic each other. When one starts to spike, the other one spikes. When one drops, the other one drops. Estrogen and progesterone are similar, not quite as in sync with LH and FSH, but you can see they both have high points and low points that they drop off during the month. So just kind of showing you that process of how those hormones will fluctuate and change from the days or through the days of the menstrual cycle. So that conversation takes us through our female anatomy. Your assignment for this particular chapter, explanation of what you need to do, will also be posted in Blackboard, so please make sure that you double check that and get that all taken care of. So we have one more face-to-face meeting, which will happen. We'll cover the male reproductive system and wrap up some loose ends on some activities and things like that that we need to do, and then that will carry us into our last day of the final.